Whitey Bulger robbed banks, committed murder, dabbled in international arms trade, and even worked as an FBI informant. He was one of the most brutal mob bosses of the 20th century, and he lived a life that played out like a Martin Scorsese film. So, today we're going to take a look at Whitey Bulger, the mobster who eluded the FBI for 16 years. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other organized crime figures you would like to hear about. Okay, grab your cup of donkeys, because we're shipping up to Boston. As a youth, Whitey Bulger constantly got into fights, and when he was only 14, he was arrested for larceny, so he was clearly eager to get started. Doing petty crimes as a teen gets you credit in your future mob career, like taking an AP class. His first major run-in with the law came after he joined a gang called the Shamrocks and was arrested for assault, battery, and armed robbery. Following the arrest, he was sent to live in a juvenile detention center. Not much is known about Bulger's time inside the detention center, but as soon as he was released, he joined the Air Force. We're not sure why. Maybe he thought he'd win more fights. Nobody argues with a guy in a jet. But his military career did not last long. Bulger quickly went AWOL. Despite running out on his commitments in the military, he received an honorable discharge in 1952. Immediately following his release, Bulger picked up where he left off in his teens, robbing banks and hijacking trucks. In 1955, he and some friends pulled off 3 major robberies, which would subsequently land him in prison for a decade. Arguably, his boldest robbery during this time period went down on May 17, 1955, when Bulger and 2 associates robbed the Industrial National Bank in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Bulger and his crew made off with just over $42,000, which was the equivalent of just over $475,000 today. He didn't get away with it for long, though. A year later, he was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, 10 of which he served in 3 different prisons in Atlanta, Alcatraz, and Kansas. Hey, at least the view kept changing. While serving time in Atlanta for armed robbery, Bulger allegedly volunteered to take part in the U.S. government's top-secret MK-Ultra program. He didn't do it out of the goodness of his heart, though. Bulger supposedly entered the program in exchange for time off his sentence. According to the man himself, inmates were told they were helping find a cure for schizophrenia, but in reality, the government was injecting them with LSD as a part of furthering what he called their brain warfare program. It sounds like the ravings of a paranoid conspiracy theorist wearing a tinfoil hat, but CIA documentation would later verify the experiments were real. Of the drug itself, Bulger said it caused a loss of appetite, hallucinations, hours of paranoia, and violent feelings. In his own words, "We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares, and even blood coming out of the walls, guys turning into skeletons in front of me. I saw a camera change into the head of a dog. It felt like I was going insane." In Bulger's defense, that sounds like a pretty bad trip, not at all like Yellow Submarine led us to believe. Bulger later claimed that he suffered from lifelong insomnia because of the experiments. It was probably the dog head thing. That would do it for anyone. After doing time for bank robbing from 1959 to 1962, Bulger returned to his old stomping grounds in Boston, something the people of Beantown would live to regret. He found work as an enforcer for Donald Clyde, a well-known criminal who ran the Transit Cafe, which was a bar that served as a cover for an illegal gambling ring. Bulger collected debts for Clyde, which is a gentle way of saying he terrorized money out of anyone who took too long to pay up. In 1972, Clyde was gunned down in his driveway. We imagine Bulger was devastated by the loss of his friend, but it wasn't enough to stop him from taking over Clyde's bar and using it to begin his own rise through the ranks of the Winter Hill Gang. From his place at the top of the hill, Bulger allegedly initiated the whacking of multiple Northeastern mob members. Wait, are we sure he was devastated about Clyde? Seems like he got over it pretty quick. In his 2011 trial, the jury decided that Bulger was complicit in 11 slayings in addition to a lengthy list of crimes, including extortion, money laundering, and drug dealing. So, he was a busy guy. Bulger's main source of income in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was the Boston drug trade, because he was a mobster in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. That's like asking a baseball player how he makes money. Bulger got a cut of every deal that happened in the city. And according to witnesses at his trial, if he wasn't paid, things got bloody. In Bulger's 2011 trial, former dealer Anthony Attardo told jurors Bulger's gang allegedly pressured him to use them as his source or pay an extra $100,000 to stay in business. Attardo did not pay up, which turned out to be an enormous mistake. While he was able to dodge Bulger for a while, the gangster eventually whacked his 17-year-old brother instead. Attardo told the jury that Bulger said he'd be next if he didn't get Bulger his money. Attardo grew up in Southie and knew Bulger's reputation. He knew how dangerous Bulger was, and that when Bulger said, "You're next," he didn't mean it for the next round of Pac-Man. Attardo quickly paid Bulger the money. Probably a good call. Your little brother probably preferred you would have done it earlier, but still, good call. As Bulger was rising through the ranks of the Winter Hill Gang in Boston, his brother, William Bulger, was traveling life on a slightly different path. William was rising through the political ranks to the presidency of the Massachusetts Senate. But blood is thicker than water, and oatmeal is thicker than both. But that's irrelevant. Even though the two brothers worked on different sides of the law, it's believed William used the power he held to keep Whitey one step ahead of the authorities. He also allegedly kept information from the FBI that could have helped put his brother behind bars much earlier than 2011. In 2003, William refused to give information about his brother to a congressional committee, likely because the information would implicate the then-senator in his brother's crimes, and also because snitches get stitches and/or end up in ditches, especially where the mob is concerned. William Bulger stepped down shortly afterwards, which was good for the rest of us, and he continued to visit his brother in prison. That's family for you. While masterminding a variety of crimes over the years, Bulger used intimidation and violence to cover his bases. While that is par for the course in terms of being a notorious gangster, Bulger was an innovator, and he decided to add one more weapon to his arsenal: the U.S. government. From 1975 to 1990, Bulger worked as an FBI informant, something he kept hidden for almost 20 years. In exchange for dropping the dime on the Patriarcha crime family, one of the oldest factions of the New England mob scene, Bulger was allowed to continue building his own criminal empire. It was a net loss for the city of Boston because Bulger was a much more violent presence than the Patriarchas. There's no record of just how many members of the underworld Bulger ratted out. However, his MO in working with the FBI became a major influence on the character of Frank Costello, played by Jack Nicholson, in Martin Scorsese's Academy Award-winning 2006 film The Departed. It's a pretty good movie, if you're into the Dropkick Murphys. In his time on the payroll, he gladly snitched on all of his Boston cohorts, while continuing to run his own extortion racket. It was a pretty great arrangement for Bulger. He was free to be as nasty as he wanted to be, while the FBI was busy taking out his competitors for him. During this time, he made friends with his federal handler, John Connolly, and used him to access all sorts of information. Connolly eventually even leaked the whereabouts of a former Bulger associate, John Callahan. Callahan later mysteriously turned up dead in Florida, but that wasn't enough to deter Connolly. In 1995, he told Bulger the FBI was tailing him and helped the criminal slip away. Hope that guy didn't get a Christmas bonus that year. Well, he probably got one from Bulger. In 1995, Bulger went on the lam with his girlfriend, Catherine Gregg. She allegedly had plastic surgery to alter her appearance, while he changed his name to Charlie Gasco, which is a good alias for a fugitive because it sounds more like the name of a ventriloquist dummy than an underworld kingpin. Whatever they were doing to stay hidden worked, and by 1998, Bulger had made it onto the FBI's 10 most wanted list for his alleged involvement in 19 deaths, on top of all the other stuff he did. In 2001, he moved up to number 2 on the list, second only to Osama bin Laden. Hey, don't take it too hard, buddy. That's like trying to knock Michael Jordan out of the top spot. There was no way that guy was going to dip below number 1, unless Thanos showed up. During his 16 years as a wanted man, reported Bulger sightings popped up everywhere from England to Los Angeles. As it turns out, he actually was in Los Angeles. It would eventually come to light that he had been living in Santa Monica, California the entire time. Honestly, not a bad place to hide out if you have to go on the run. But in 2011, the FBI finally closed in on Bulger after receiving a tip that the octogenarian was alive and well on the West Coast. His neighbor had been keeping an eye on him, and when the FBI publicized their manhunt for Bulger, she eventually put the pieces together and called in the G-Men. After searching Bulger's apartment, the FBI discovered 30 guns, almost $1 million, and multiple knives hidden in the walls. Man, that's like the most terrifying version of the Batcave. They arrested both Bulger and Greg, who was charged with conspiracy to harbor a fugitive, conspiracy to commit identity fraud, and identity fraud. On October 30th, 2018, Whitey Bulger passed away in a West Virginia prison. Earlier that morning, Bulger had been transferred from a penitentiary in Florida, but within hours of his arrival, authorities found him unresponsive. The Federal Bureau of Prisons wouldn't comment on Bulger's death beyond confirming he was deceased. But an anonymous law enforcement official eventually revealed Bulger was taken out by his fellow inmates. It is now believed that Bulger was fatally beaten with a padlock wrapped in a sock while sitting in a wheelchair. He was also attacked by another inmate armed with a shiv, and there are reports that Bulger was discovered with both eyes and his tongue missing. In other words, all those years of snitching for the FBI finally caught up to him. The FBI hasn't confirmed why Bulger was transferred in the first place. A lawsuit filed by Bulger's family claiming the transfer was intended to deliberately place Bulger in harm's way was dismissed by the courts. Whatever the reason, in August of 2022, 3 men were charged with Bulger's, let's call it extreme, whacking. At least he hung in there long enough to see the Johnny Depp movie they made about him. The 18th Amendment was intended to help America sober up, but as we all now know, it didn't really go that way. Instead, smuggling alcohol during Prohibition became a massive industry, and at the heart of that industry were the bootleggers. So, today we're going to take a look at what it was like to be a Prohibition bootlegger. Okay, buckle up. We've got a long way to go and a short time to get there. In 1917, the United States Congress voted to approve a constitutional amendment banning the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating beverages. It would be ratified by the states in 1919, and by 1920, Prohibition was the law of the land, to the disappointment of animated sitcom dads everywhere. The 18th Amendment was the crowning achievement of the temperance movement, which traced its roots back to the 19th century. Supporters of the movement blamed a lot of society's ills on the consumption of alcohol and generally thought people would be healthier and happier without it. The reality of Prohibition, however, turned out to be very different. Crime rates soared, gang violence intensified, and alcohol was still widely available. And it was mostly because of bootleggers. The federal law that carried out the intent of the 18th Amendment was known as the Volstead Act, which permitted alcohol like whiskey and brandy if prescribed by a physician for medicinal purposes. Unsurprisingly, many Americans quickly became very health conscious, and doctors made $40 million writing prescriptions for alcohol. That's about $500 million in today's dollars, which is a lot of hooch. But if you couldn't convince your doctor to write you a prescription, you had to rely on the bootleggers. Bootleggers obviously couldn't sell their product door to door, so they needed a secret place where drinkers could come to them. That place was the speakeasy. Speakeasies, also known as blind tigers or blind pigs, because if you're going to break the law, you might as well have fun with it, were illegal establishments typically owned or controlled by a criminal syndicate. Speakeasies started out as little more than a place to sit and drink. As Prohibition dragged on, however, many expanded to include entertainment. And despite frequent raids by the police, the businesses were profitable and popular. In 1925, one New York bootlegger even alleged that a specific cross street in Midtown Manhattan contained 32 speakeasies. If one was shut down, the clientele would just start going to the next place. So they were secret, but they weren't that secret. Speakeasies also had an appreciable effect on American culture, being among the first businesses where people of all races would mix and mingle. These drinking establishments, looking to pad their profits, were also generally welcoming of women, which was still something of a novelty at the time. And of course, they left their mark on drinking culture. The quality of the booze available at the speakeasies often wasn't too great, so cocktails that emphasized the taste of raw liquor fell out of fashion. Instead, mixed drinks that masked the liquor's flavor became all the rage. Now you know who to blame for Jaeger bombs. Being a bootlegger took a lot more than just making alcohol. For one, you had to be a bit of a con man. Bootlegging often required selling booze that was watered down from higher quality products, but that didn't mean you'd want to charge less for it. On the contrary, in a piece published in the New Yorker in 1926, one unnamed bootlegger pointed out that customers would assume the booze was high quality if they were paying what they'd expect to pay for high-quality booze. Plus, what were they gonna do? Not buy it? Have you ever tried being sober in the 1920s? A bootlegger also had to be able to drop the right name if they got picked up by the police. That same anonymous bootlegger told the New Yorker that he was typically given the name of a crooked politician to drop to the cops, who would then let him go scot-free. Bootleggers also had to be comfortable moving around in cramped spaces. Why? Because moving booze around a city often required the use of secret tunnels. Los Angeles bootleggers used a network of tunnels that was originally built for trolley cars. Meanwhile, Chicago bootleggers used a series of basements in the Uptown area that allegedly connected places like the Green Mill Cocktail Lounge, the Uptown Theater, and the Aragon Ballroom. In case all the secret passageways didn't tip you off, hiding alcohol during Prohibition required some inventiveness. One way to travel around with your secret stash was a flask cane or tippling cane. These were hollow canes one could fill with their drink of choice, for those days when you felt like getting hammered while still looking distinguished. Alternatively, folks could carry their drink around in a thigh flask, also known as a thigh tin. Calling this a flask is a bit of an understatement, since they were so big you pretty much had to wear an overcoat to hide one. Luckily, there were more discreet versions like the garter flask, which women could strap to their legs. There were also fake book flasks, which were exactly what they sounded like, fake books with liquor inside. These could get pretty elaborate. For example, one fake book concealing 4 flasks came with a clever title, Spring Poems, The 4 Swallows. Only slightly more subtle than The Hardy Boys in the Case of the Hidden Booze. Of course, people needed ways to hide larger quantities as well. For example, it is estimated that up to 75% of alcohol consumed in the U.S. during the Prohibition era came from bootlegging operations between Windsor, Canada, and Detroit, Michigan. So how did they move all that booze across the Detroit River? Easy. Both ordinary people and gangsters alike could transport up to 40 cases of alcohol an hour via torpedoes pulled across the river on an underwater cable system. The river could also be crossed in speedboats guarded by lookouts with binoculars. And during the winter, when the water froze over, gutsy bootleggers might just drive the booze right across the ice. If all else failed, there was always a good old-fashioned booze mule. Men who would strap alcohol-filled pouches all over their torso, throw on an overcoat, and then just walk to their destination. Has anyone ever worn an overcoat who wasn't hiding something? In the early years of Prohibition, bootleggers were often supplied by so-called rum runners, who would smuggle alcohol across international waters. The job entailed enormous risks. Because most rum running took place under cover of darkness and in fog, it wasn't unusual for ships to sink with all hands on deck. Gun battles with the Coast Guard were also common. This made it increasingly difficult to get larger boats to the coast, so the rum runners began keeping their vessels just outside U.S. territorial limits. This line, 3 miles out to sea, became known as Rum Row. Smugglers would wait at Rum Row, then rendezvous with lighter, more agile crafts called contact boats, which would bring the rum ashore. Successful rum runners could make upwards of $100,000 a year, which was a whole lot of money in the 20s. Heck, it's a whole lot of money now. But you'd probably want to think twice before making a career change. In addition to all the dangers, most rum runners worked for some of the most vicious organized crime syndicates in the world. As anyone who's ever seen The Untouchables or Boardwalk Empire knows, no one benefited from Prohibition more than organized crime. Gangsters who previously made their livings running gambling and prostitution rings quickly switched over to bootlegging once they realized how much greater the profits were. Organizations like the Mafia flourished at an unprecedented scale, and the corruption of public officials became commonplace. Unlike today, when it's less commonplace? The most notorious gangster of the era was Al Capone, who made a fortune selling bootleg liquor in Chicago. Gangsters like Capone used violence to secure their power, and in the first 4 years of Prohibition alone, over 200 gangland slayings were recorded in Chicago. Capone, however, wasn't the only terrifying, legitimate businessman of the Prohibition era. Notorious gangsters like Dutch Schultz, Charles Lucky Luciano, Dino Binion, Arnold the Brain Rothstein, Enoch Lewis Nucky Johnson, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel were all involved in bootlegging to some degree. As good as it was for organized crime, Prohibition was terrible for the legitimate manufacturing industry. Records show that in 1873, the U.S. had approximately 4,000 breweries. As temperance picked up steam by 1910, there were closer to 1,500. From 1920 to 1933, of course, there were none. Yet some of those companies did manage to survive. Wisconsin's Pabst Brewing Company struck the word brewing from its name and started producing a cheese spread called Pabstet. No word on whether the spread also won a blue ribbon. Yuengling switched to near beer with 3 offerings: the Yuengling Special, Yuengling Portor, and Yuengling Juvo. They also started making ice cream, which maybe tastes like beer. Anheuser-Busch also tried out the ice cream business and experimented with soft drinks and non-alcoholic malt beverages. And a few distilleries, like Jim Beam, managed to scrape by thanks to the medicinal alcohol exception to the dry laws. Believe it or not, the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, or NASCAR, traces its roots back to outlaw moonshiners trying to keep one step ahead of the fuzz. The practice of moonshining actually dates back to the 18th century, but Prohibition kicked it into high gear. Both demand and supply skyrocketed, and the moonshiners needed a safe, effective, and low-key way to move all that alcohol around. The answer became cars that appeared to be stock on the outside, but on the inside were anything but. These cars were outfitted with high-powered engines so they could outrun the law, heavy-duty shocks and springs to protect their cargo, and usually had their back seats removed for additional storage space, or for some rad subwoofers. When Prohibition ended, many of the moonshine runners still had their souped-up stock cars. Organized races became common, and in December of 1947, a mechanic named Big Bill France decided to take it to the next level. He met with various car owners, drivers, and mechanics to establish a set of standardized racing rules. The result of their agreement was NASCAR, and beer commercials have never been the same. In 1933, after what was undoubtedly a very long 13 years, the United States Congress decided to repeal Prohibition. The 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment, was submitted to the states for ratification in February. Legend has it that soon after, then-President Franklin D. Roosevelt opined to an aide that it was surely a good time for a beer. The term organized crime refers to any centralized enterprise that has been established for the purpose of engaging in unlawful activities. Even though law enforcement has brought many of these criminals to justice, several groups continue to thrive. So, today we're going to take a look at some facts about organized crime around the world. Okay, time to round up the usual suspects. Just like any other team sport, communication is key to an organized crime group's success. But unlike most sports teams, unless you're the Houston Astros, criminals have to hide their communications from law enforcement. And since public information networks can be monitored by governments, the Zetas drug cartel began grabbing Mexican engineers to build and maintain their own radio network. It is believed that by 2015, the Zetas and other similar gangs kidnapped approximately 40 skilled technicians, engineers, and professionals. Evidence found has proven these people were creating private communication networks for the cartels. In fact, in 2011, the Zetas radio communication network comprised 167 antennas and 155 relay stations. These linked approximately 1,300 phones, 1,450 radios, and 1,350 Nextel devices, controlled by 70 computers. Authorities are constantly destroying the telecommunication facilities that make it all run, but more always pop up to replace them, like the most high-stakes game of whack-a-mole ever. Well, unless you're the mole, then every game is pretty high stakes. What do the iconic singer Frank Sinatra and the Kennedy family have in common? If you guessed they were both as mobbed up as Mo Green, then you win the prize. According to Sinatra's daughter, Tina, her father was the liaison between the Kennedy family and the Chicago Mafia when the Kennedys needed assistance getting union support for the 1960 presidential election. Sinatra's daughter stated that Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., patriarch of the dynasty, wanted the Mafia's help delivering the Union vote, so he asked Frank to request the mob's assistance, since he knew Sinatra had access to Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana. Old Blue Eyes agreed and convinced Giancana to help. Yet shortly after the Kennedys won the election, the Kennedy administration began cracking down on the Mafia, enraging Giancana. Since Frank was the only one who asked for the favor, it was on him. Luckily, to repay his debt, he just had to play a week-long run of shows at Giancana's club. Why don't more places take payment in the form of jazz crooning? The United States of America has tens of millions of substance users, comprising the world's biggest drug market. In 2013, approximately 10% of the U.S. population over the age of 12 could be classified as a recent drug user. So if you're part of that 10%, take a bow, then order some Taco Bell? With figures like these, it's unsurprising that selling drugs in America has made the Mexican cartels enough money to build a skyscraper out of gold that reaches to the moon. Okay, that may be a slight exaggeration, but according to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Mexican cartels earn between $19 and $29 billion each year from American sales alone. And how much could a golden moon skyscraper really be? $9 billion? It is believed that the Yakuza, the name given to organized crime syndicates in Japan, was founded in the 17th century, and that at present they have approximately 30,000 members scattered across the world. We did a whole episode on this shadowy entity if you want to check it out. Go ahead. We'll wait. How does an organization as allegedly large as the Yakuza claim hide its dealings? Well, it doesn't. The Yakuza's dealings are well known, including things like extortion, protection rackets, gambling, trafficking, construction, and real estate. Because apparently even the Yakuza knows you gotta diversify your investments. Like other crime groups, the Yakuza operate both legitimate and illegitimate businesses. But unlike most other crime groups, some Yakuza are based in office buildings, use their own corporate logos, and provide pension plans to their members. Some of them even have newsletters. These gangs are regulated by Japanese law, but surprisingly, they're not banned, which is a testament to their influence. Tony Soprano could never have a mailing list. The Aryan Brotherhood is largely considered to be the most violent white supremacist gang in the US, so you probably don't want to invite them over to watch the game. The group started out as a gang in federal prisons, then quickly became an influential player in organized crime. In fact, the Aryan Brotherhood now has a strong enough network on the outside to be considered an organized crime group themselves. These guys have a fearsome reputation for good reason. They are reportedly responsible for 18 to 25% of all homicides committed in the American federal prison system. Additionally, they're responsible for a string of criminal activities and the slayings of influential people outside the prison walls. Like an acoustic guitar at a party, the Aryan Brotherhood should be avoided at all costs. Omid Tavili is believed to be an Iranian-Canadian kingpin of an organized crime group that operates in Canada. The group has been connected to multiple international crime organizations, and Tavili was listed as one of the world's 10 most wanted fugitives after he escaped prison in 2007. According to news reports, Tavili sprung himself from the joint after bribing a guard to help him escape in a janitor's uniform. The disguise allowed him to simply walk out of the front door of the high-security prison, which is way easier than the crawling through a tunnel of poop technique Andy Dufresne used to get out of Shawshank. For his crime of helping Tavili fly the coop, the guard was sentenced to 3 years and 3 months in jail. Tavili was sentenced to 11 years in prison in absentia and is a still wanted fugitive, which has probably added some numbers to his sentence. Where's Unsolved Mysteries when you need it? During the 1990s, Vladimir Barshukov led the Tambov Gang, the most feared, ruthless, and politically connected crime syndicate in St. Petersburg. During this time, Barshukov was often referred to as the Knight Governor of St. Petersburg, which, to be blunt, is a really impressive nickname. So how did he get such an awesome alias? Besides running a feared crime organization, Barshukov was the point person for many politicians, a series of interconnected relationships that began when he started doing contract work with the St. Petersburg government to seem like a legitimate businessman. The group is rumored to include Vladimir Putin, so that should give you an idea of how powerful this dude was. Barshukov's reign of terror ended in the early 2000s, and he was sentenced to 14 years in prison in 2009. The Triads, a Chinese organized crime unit, trace their origins back to a 17th century movement to overthrow the Qing dynasty and restore Ming rule in China. But in 1949, when the Communist Party took over, many Triad families had to flee to other parts of the world, including North America, Europe, Australia, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. They were able to build up their criminal influence in these regions despite losing power in their home country, which is basically just the plot of The Godfather Part 2, but with less Diane Keaton. Today, the Triads participate in loan sharking, drug trafficking, credit card fraud, CD pirating, prostitution, gun running, and, just to keep things fun, minibus concession stands. Don't knock them until you've tried their churros. The Eurasian criminal group, the Shulaya Enterprise, isn't as large as the Triads or the Yakuza, but they have had their fingers in a whole lot of sinister pies. Even so, it's still hard to understand exactly why they decided to steal 10,000 pounds of chocolate from some cargo ships. Maybe they were expecting a lot of trick-or-treaters that year. But the presumably historic chocolate theft wasn't the only bit of criminal activity the Shulaya Enterprise were charged with in 2017. Their leader, Russian Razden Shulaya, was also arrested on charges of fraud, extortion, and robbery, which sounds way tougher than the whole chocolate thing. He's like Willy Wonka with a switchblade. According to authorities, the Shulaya Enterprise was also under investigation for plans to bribe law enforcement, the running of illicit poker businesses, the sales and transportation of untaxed cigarettes, and a conspiracy to steal 500 tons of candy corn. Okay, we may have made that last one up. But if 5 tons of chocolate is on the table, no kernel of candy corn is safe. All's fair in love and war, including working alongside convicted mobsters. That typically just applies to the war part of the saying, but mobsters need love too. To prevent enemy sabotage during World War II, the American government enlisted the help of the mob, who agreed to assist only if Charles Luciano, otherwise known as Lucky Luciano, was involved. Lucky was such a badass that even after being imprisoned for 6 years, he still had absolute power over the New York docks. And the government just so happened to need access to those docks to obtain intelligence for the war, as they were worried Italian and German agents might use them as an entry point to slip into the U.S. undetected. Luciano wasn't really big on helping the feds, but his freedom was on the line. So he ordered his informants to work alongside the government and act as lookouts, reporting all suspicious activity they witnessed. This tenuous relationship even had a dope official name, Operation Underworld. At the end of the war, Luciano filed a petition for executive clemency, which was granted because of his assistance. Then in 1946, he was pardoned and deported to Italy, which must have been an unbearable punishment for an Italian mob boss. Even though notorious gangster Al Capone led a publicly extravagant lifestyle, he never once filed a federal income tax return. You'd think that's the kind of thing an experienced criminal would keep on the down low. But Capone decided to brag about it instead, claiming he had no taxable income because his money was acquired illegally. It was a pretty funny joke, until Kevin Costner and his untouchable dance crew showed up. You see, unfortunately for Capone, money you make illegally is still taxable. So the IRS had him under investigation, eventually indicting him on 20 counts of federal income tax evasion. On October 24, 1931, he was sentenced and fined $50,000, which is roughly around $800,000 in today's money. Additionally, he was ordered to pay back taxes of $215,000, which is now an estimated $3.5 million, which just goes to show you, if you feel like you're getting away with something, it's best to keep your mouth shut. In 1921, a mob of 10,000 whites descended on the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, then the richest black neighborhood in the entire United States. Hundreds of black residents were murdered in what became the deadliest massacre on American soil since the Civil War. The Tulsa Massacre is one of the most tragic and disturbing incidents of racial violence in U.S. history, yet it's rarely mentioned in the history books. Today, we're going to take a look at how a racist mob destroyed America's richest black neighborhood. An early 20th century oil boom drew people to Oklahoma. By 1920, the population of Tulsa was over 100,000 and growing, with many of the new residents being black. Existing racial tensions were escalating, and whites who were concerned about having to let black people into their neighborhoods for the first time didn't exactly roll out the welcome wagon. Instead, they sprang into action, and in August of 1916, the city passed a residential segregation ordinance. The new law, once enacted, prevented blacks from living on any block where 75% of the other residents were white. Black citizens would have to look for a home elsewhere. The black district of Tulsa was called Greenwood. Despite legal segregation, the neighborhood and its population thrived. Greenwood had 2 independent newspapers and was filled with black-owned businesses, including the largest black-owned hotel in the country. Booker T. Washington was so impressed with Greenwood, he called it the Negro Wall Street. It all started on May 30th, 1921, when a 19-year-old shoeshiner named Dick Rowland entered the Drexel Building, an office located at 319 South Main Street in Tulsa. He needed to use a public bathroom, but because he was black, segregation laws restricted him to using facilities located at the top of the building. Getting there required taking the elevator, and that's where Dick encountered the elevator operator, a 17-year-old white woman named Sarah Page. Whether or not Dick Rowland and Sarah Page knew each other is a matter of debate. What happened in the elevator that day is also unknown. An article in the Tulsa Tribune reported that Rowland attacked Page, scratching her hands and face and tearing her clothes. Conversely, author Mary Parrish, writing less than a year after the events, reported that the black man had merely stepped on the girl's shoes by accident. What is known is that a clerk in a nearby department store heard what he thought was a woman screaming. He went to investigate and saw a young black man run from the building. Then he found Page in the elevator. She was said to be in a state of distress, so the clerk concluded she had been attacked and reported as much to the police. The contents of Sarah Page's statements to the police have been lost, but she did decline pressing charges, and no manhunt was conducted. Rowland, however, knew that the mere accusation of attacking a white woman could make him the target of an angry white mob. He fled to his mother's house in Greenwood. Rowland was located by police and arrested shortly thereafter. The white-owned Tulsa Tribune, known for its sensationalist takes, broke the story in their afternoon edition with the incendiary headline, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in an Elevator." Rumors that Rowland would be lynched spread like wildfire, and by 7:30 p.m. on May 31st, hundreds of white residents had gathered outside the courthouse. Only a year earlier, a small mob lynched a white murder suspect named Roy Belton, and the newly elected local sheriff, Willard M. McCullough, was looking to avoid a similar incident. At approximately 8:30 p.m., 3 white men entered the courthouse and demanded Rowland be handed over to them. McCullough refused and sent the men back out. By 9:30 p.m., the crowd had swelled to thousands. The sheriff was vastly outnumbered. It was about this time that a group of 50 to 60 armed black citizens arrived to support the sheriff. He turned down their offer, but their arrival had prompted many of the white citizens to head home for their own guns. Some even attempted to steal arms from a nearby National Guard armory. At 10 p.m., a second group of armed black citizens arrived to support the sheriff, but were turned away as well. As they were leaving the courthouse, a white man approached a black war veteran, calling him a racial slur, and tried to take his gun. A shot rang out, and then all hell broke loose. Both sides began to fire, but the small group of black citizens was outnumbered 20 to 1, and they retreated towards Greenwood. The gunfight followed them the whole way, and the whites used it as an excuse to massacre innocent black citizens. One unarmed black man was even chased into a theater and murdered on the stage. Calling the incident a Negro uprising, the local police deputized almost 500 white men, many of whom had been members of the lynch mob that had created the whole situation in the first place. The new deputies were instructed to arm themselves and were then ordered to shoot blacks in the streets. Meanwhile, a white mob headed for Greenwood. The mob descended on Greenwood with a fury, burning houses and businesses. By the morning of June 1st, the mob had grown to approximately 10,000 white citizens. They poured into the district, looting, destroying, and murdering black residents by the hundreds. Other armed whites were breaking into black homes and arresting the residents. Any who dared resist would be immediately killed. Buck Colbert Franklin, a Tulsa resident and lawyer, was a witness to the destruction of Greenwood. He recalled hearing something that sounded like hail falling on the roof of his office building. He looked out the window and saw a hotel on fire. It was burning from the top down. Then he noticed a second building, and then a third, then others, all burning from the top down. As he stood and watched, he noticed planes circling overhead, maybe a dozen or more in number. Through a thick cloud of smoke, he could see them drop what he called burning turpentine balls on the tops of various businesses and homes. Immediately, he knew all too well why every burning building first caught from the top. At the same time, other reports hold that white men fired guns from the planes, shooting black residents as they walked along the ground. The planes, as it would turn out, were military biplane trainers from World War I that had lifted off from Curtis Southwest Field, just outside the city. Law enforcement officials subsequently said the planes were protection, but the survivors of the massacre knew better. The mob burned everything. Hotels, restaurants, grocery stores, doctors' offices, pharmacies, a public library, a dozen churches, and over 1,000 private homes. As Franklin watched, he wondered where Tulsa's splendid fire department was, and considered the possibility the city was in league with the racist mob. By the time the sun came up, the National Guard had arrived to restore order. However, instead of targeting the white mob, many of the troops went after the black residents instead. Over 6,000 people were arrested and imprisoned at Convention Hall, and not a single one was white. On June 1, 1921, Greenwood was still burning. Thousands of black residents had been imprisoned, hundreds more were dead, and to add insult to injury, the Morning Tulsa Daily World's headline for the day was, "2 Whites Dead in Race Riots." The article claimed that 500 armed whites had heroically held off 1,000 armed blacks. Later in the day, a different headline added fuel to the fire by exclaiming, "Many more whites shot." The black lives that had been lost were completely disregarded by the media, and the stage was set for the grand jury to hang the blame for the whole thing on the people of Greenwood. The Stratford Hotel was the largest business of its kind owned by a black person in the U.S. prior to the Civil Rights era. Stratford's hotel had 54 rooms equipped with luxuries like crystal chandeliers and was worth somewhere in the area of $75,000, which is roughly the equivalent of about $1 million current dollars. Nonetheless, it was destroyed along with the rest of Greenwood during the massacre. In a just world, Stratford would have received restitution for his loss, but 1921 Tulsa was anything but just. Stratford was arrested, along with 69 other men, and charged with inciting the riot that ultimately burned down his own hotel. He would later jump bail and flee the state to avoid being lynched. Stratford went on to be a lawyer in Chicago and never returned to Oklahoma. He was finally cleared of the charges against him in 1996, 60 years after he passed away. By the time it was all over, the neighborhood once known as the Black Wall Street was uninhabitable. Black businessmen and homeowners were denied relief by the courts, and their insurance companies refused to cover the damage. Dick Rowland was never charged in connection with the incident in the elevator. He eventually left Tulsa and never returned. Looking back, many speculate that the alleged attack on Sarah Page was merely a pretext for Tulsa's white residents to destroy a successful black community they had always hated. The massacre became a celebrated event in some quarters. Postcards commemorating the violence and destruction even circulated among some white collectors. As Paul Gardulo, a curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, points out, the truth of the matter has to do with the threat that black power, black economic power, black cultural power, black success posed to individuals and the whole system of white supremacy. In 2001, an investigation held the city partly responsible for the Greenwood massacre, finding that the police themselves were actively involved in the mob violence. The city of Tulsa was ordered to pay reparations to the survivors of the massacre and their descendants. As of 2020, they have still not been paid. The 1930s were a time of great change that saw many milestones that would come to define the decade. The Great Depression affected millions across America. The Graf Zeppelin completed a historic journey, and the New Deal ushered in an era of social programs we still use today. And pinball emerged as a popular new pastime, although it quickly drew the ire of New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, who went to war with the silver ball because of its alleged ties to the underworld and illegal gambling. Today, we're taking a look at how pinball was banned in the United States because of the mob. Okay, that weird history kid sure plays a mean pinball. From the flashing lights to the endorphin-triggering sound effects to the thrill of slapping your coins down on a machine to call next game, there's nothing quite like pinball. Pinball actually started out as an improved version of the French game, bagatelle. More like a variation of billiards, bagatelle involved hitting a ball around a small table with a stick. The ball would bounce around a series of bumpers and eventually landed in one of the holes. At one point in history, this was considered the bleeding edge of fun. Don't judge them too harshly. The Sega Game Gear was but a distant twinkle in a hedgehog's eye. Fast forward to 1871, when Montague Redgrave, an Englishman residing in Cincinnati, added his own tweaks to bagatelle to create an early version of what would eventually become pinball. With a name like Montague Redgrave, we hardly needed to tell you that he was British. Redgrave's modifications included making the game smaller, adding a plunger, and using small marbles rather than the standard ball. He called it improvements in bagatelle. Apparently, Redgrave's imagination did not extend to the world of catchy names. Nonetheless, his new version caught on and allowed bagatelle to become a countertop game. This led to the machine being used for gambling purposes and prompted further innovation through the next few decades. But Redgrave's game was all dependent on luck. Players released the ball, and from that point on, wherever it went was pretty much out of their control. And it lacked a key control feature that most of us immediately associate with pinball: flippers. In fact, flippers didn't show up until surprisingly late in pinball's history, but more on that in a bit. 5 decades later, an Ohio resident, a Youngstown carpenter named Arthur Paulin, created the game that would spawn the pinball craze in 1930. Paulin found an old board full of holes and nails in his barn. Because this was the Great Depression, he decided to turn that naily board into a gift for his daughter. After tinkering with it for a while, he cobbled together a bagatelle-like game. And that is when everything changed. Kids from around the neighborhood began lining up to play. So Paulin did what anyone would do in such a situation. He decided to charge a nickel per play. Hey, it was the Depression. Although, where did he think those kids were going to get a bunch of nickels? After some collaboration with folks around town, the game eventually had a coin slot and ball return installed. He called his invention Whiffle. Hey, he did better than Redgrave. That guy would have named it Ball and Hole Wood Board, or something. Once released in town, the game began making money and started selling around the country. Although it wasn't the first early pinball machine to be developed in the US, it was the first to be commercially sold. And it paved the way for what was to come later. Pinball quickly grew in popularity during the Great Depression. It offered cheap fun in a time when very little else did. Basically, you had pinball and stickball, and with stickball, you had to provide your own ball and stick. Due to a decent profit split of 50-50 in most cases, pinball also helped keep some businesses going. But the exciting new amusement gained a reputation as a gambling device. New York City's mayor and airport namesake, Fiorello LaGuardia, spent the early 1930s cracking down on gambling and slot machines in the city. LaGuardia eventually went on a crusade against pinball games, calling the machines a racket dominated by interests heavily tainted with criminality. Yeah, does it remind you of anything today? I'm looking at you, putt-putt arcades. LaGuardia successfully had pinball declared an illegal game of chance. And just like that, pinball was banned in New York City by 1940. So what was LaGuardia's problem with pinball anyway? Was he just lousy at it? Well, as a direct result of LaGuardia's crackdown on gambling, many gamblers turned to pinball to satisfy their desire to make wagers and bets, and generally scratch that gambling itch. Per Edward Trapinski's Special When Lit, the pinball manufacturers likely facilitated this, leading to them becoming associated with gambling and vice. The term pinball didn't even exist until a Kentucky reporter coined the term to cover a story about gambling machines. But there was another reason pinball machines were linked to gambling and organized crime. One of the main reasons pinball became associated with mob control was due to the most popular manufacturers being located in Chicago. Whereas modern-day Chicago is associated with the Bulls and deep dish pizza, at the time Chicago was known for organized crime. Although in fairness, deep dish pizza is a form of organized crime. But beyond the geographic connection, there was some evidence the Mafia had their hands in pinball machines as well. Pinball was a great income source at a time when money was hard to come by. Pinball wasn't easy to win. Remember, flippers still hadn't been invented yet, so each game was at the mercy of the god of amusement machines. Consequently, whichever business owned a pinball machine could essentially rake in losers' money as they continued to feed their coins to the game. And with the end of Prohibition, members of the mob likely did control some of the pinball, whether it was through gambling or protection rackets. As a result of the mob connection, many churches and law enforcement agencies began to publicly condemn pinball. Pinball was ruled a game of chance, not a game of skill, in a 1935 court case, putting some weight behind LaGuardia's assertions that it was a form of gambling. And while Mayor Frowny Stormcloud was doing his best to ruin everyone's fun, he wasn't entirely wrong about pinball. Since flippers didn't exist yet, players basically just propelled the ball with the plunger, and then Lady Luck took care of the rest. And since many pinball machines were single-play machines with money involved, it did look suspiciously like gambling. One machine, called Rocket, even had a payout for players who hit high scores. That's just a slot machine, right, fellas? We can all agree on that one, right? Rocket came with a flyer explaining to users that it could be operated in open or closed territory, which meant its payout function could be toggled on or off. In other words, it could be switched back and forth between a novelty game and a game of chance. This probably contributed to the perception of pinball games as gambling machines. According to pinball enthusiast Jim West, players might have perceived games like Rocket to be more fair than a standard slot machine. According to this concern, store owners lowered the price of pinball from a nickel to a penny during school hours. Because the best gambling addicts start young. Furthermore, some stores would hand out prizes in the form of packs of cigarettes and even firearms to people who achieved a certain high score. That's right. In an alternate universe, landing a high score on the Waterworld pinball machine could have come with a pack of smokes and a free gun. We truly are living in the worst timeline. Organized crime saw opportunity in pinball as Prohibition came to an end. It was kind of like portfolio diversification. Around this time, a distributor named Ray Maloney created a new machine called Ballyhoo. The game was a success, prompting him to rename his manufacturing company Bally. You've probably seen that name stamped on the sides of several pinball machines to this day. Maloney and his company Bally played on the concept of pinball as a gambling machine, and most sources say he developed ties to the Mafia. Developments like these made LaGuardia furious, because he believed it encouraged truancy and bad behavior. He was worried about the kids falling under the influence of the insidious game. Among other things, he predicted they would start ditching school to play arcade games. Oh well, I guess they do end up doing that. Okay, the guy may have been a sourpuss, but he wasn't exactly wrong. He was like the Nostradamus of coin-operated gaming. Speaking of those kids, every decade or so, America likes to have a good old-fashioned moral panic over something that's poisoning the minds of children.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
Rock and roll, Dungeons and Dragons, violent video games, and, I don't know, Baywatch probably, all have shared this dubious honor. But in the 1930s and 40s, the culprit responsible for corrupting the youth was pinball. Since pinball was essentially a game of chance, still no flippers at this point, LaGuardia felt the game could be addictive and used for gambling. He considered the games to be slight variations of slot machines, because they pretty much were, and he sought to eliminate their influence entirely. For LaGuardia, who had a history of crusading against any form of gambling whatsoever, the opportunity to defeat pinball was compelling. He made it his mission to seize the offending machines and clean up the town. He posed for photos with police who were destroying machines. Can't really hold that against him. It's a prime selfie opportunity. And there's even a famous photo of him holding a sledgehammer, smashing pinball machines all around him like Peter Gabriel in a protection racket. Just because LaGuardia banned pinball in the city didn't mean pinball manufacturers were just going to sit there and take it. Not when there were nickels to be made. 4 different pinball manufacturers brought forth a lawsuit against the crackdown in 1948. It made it all the way to the New York Supreme Court. As the hearing unfolded, the district attorney of Kings County sought to bring damning evidence against the pinball industry. He claimed the notorious organized crime outfit, Murder, Inc., had a connection to pinball, alleging that the gang would use the machines as part of their protection and shakedown schemes. According to Michael Scheiss, the founder of the Pacific Pinball Museum in Alameda, California, the Mafia gave pinball manufacturers startup funds throughout the 1930s, ostensibly to invest in pinball machines after slot machines were outlawed. In his book Small Time, author Russell Shapiro discusses his family's involvement with pinball and the mob. He wrote, "The beauty of pinball to the mob was that since coins you put in didn't correspond with a quantifiable product like cigarettes or candy, it was impossible to track the machine's earnings. The high-tech fun of the game, plus the possibility of beating it for cash, made them addictive." In other words, they were perfect little money laundering machines, and the novelty and addictive nature of the game kept people coming back for more. Two New Yorkers, Sidney Turner and Sadie Billett, used their pinball machines for gambling. They went to court over it, paid a fine of $50, and lost their city-issued licenses, which stipulated that the holder was only permitted to operate pinball machines for amusement purposes. Read, not for gambling. Eventually, events like these steadily drove pinball underground. Prohibition-style raids on pinball forced it to go further underground, where it remained for the next few decades. The United States entered World War II after the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, and the need for scrap metal around the country led to some major changes in daily life. It also drastically changed public opinion about pinball machines. The Salvage for Victory campaign compelled Americans to turn in any scrap metal they could find to help the war effort. And pinball is like 90% scrap metal. It was a game Arthur Paulin first built out of literal junk. LaGuardia saw an opportunity to further his attack on pinball, seizing the machines for the scrap metal. 2,500 of the 3,000 machines he confiscated equated to about 1 ton of metal after he took his sledgehammer to them. The pinball ban continued for a long time afterward, but was eventually overturned. It seems strange, but pinball was banned in New York City until 1976, 8 years after Pinball Wizard was bouncing around the Billboard Hot 100. In other words, the game was fairly mainstream at that point, which makes its banned status all the more surprising. Even more surprising, the addition of the now ubiquitous flipper had a lot to do with getting the ban lifted. Before flippers came about, people rocked and tilted the machines to make the ball go their way. If we're being really honest, people still do that. Flippers didn't do away with the inherent need to shake your way to a high score. That's why pinball tables have a tilt function that voids a player's ball if they get too feisty. The point is, there wasn't any skill required, giving pinball the designation of a game of chance instead of a game of skill. The flipper's invention changed that. Although LaGuardia had a point about some of the bad actors using pinball to circumvent gambling restrictions, flippers changed the game entirely. Giving players the ability to control the ball's movements around the table racked up more points in the skill category than the chance category, meaning it could no longer be considered the same as a slot machine. At least that's what Roger Sharp, a magazine editor in his mid-20s, aimed to convince the courts. So what changed the city's mind about the game? According to Pinball Wizards by Adam Rubin, Sharp was a pinball enthusiast who regularly wrote about the game for several publications. Eventually, he stumbled upon a plan to help turn over the ban. Since games of skill were exempt from the gambling bans, Sharp found a way to prove pinball fit into that category. When he testified to the city council, he offered to demonstrate that pinball was a game of skill with the machine El Dorado. But the councilman pulled a gotcha move worthy of the most thrilling John Grisham courtroom drama and had him play a table called Bank Shot instead. Sharp insisted the last-minute switch wasn't a problem. He told them he could expertly drop his ball into the game's middle slot, thus proving that pinball depended more on skill than random chance. He pulled back the plunger and let the ball fly, then worked the flippers until the ball dropped into the middle slot, exactly like he'd said. After seeing this skillful display, the city council decided to overturn the ban on pinball, making it legal once again in the Big Apple. For Sharp, this represented a victory for pinball enthusiasts everywhere. But the truth was, he'd been bluffing about making the shot. He knew it theoretically could be done, but he had no idea if he could actually pull it off. It was like Babe Ruth calling a shot, if Babe were a line cook making wagers on an Addams Family table at his uncle's pizzeria. The Godfather, Goodfellas, and The Sopranos make mafia life seem dangerously glamorous. But in reality, the day-to-day operations of the mob are often much duller than what we see on screen. Work can be surprisingly laborious, money can be scarce, and it's almost impossible to move up in the ranks. Today, we're taking a look at what it's really like to be in the Mafia. Okay, time to analyze this. Hey, they can't all be Godfather references. If you've ever watched a Scorsese movie, you're probably familiar with the golden age of the mob, which began around the 1920s and lasted through the 1970s. Former made men say that while organized crime does still exist, being in the business is nothing like it used to be. Whether you're sitting at a desk job talking real estate, managing a construction site, or running a money laundering restaurant, it's a far cry from the extortion, shakedowns, and shootouts of decades past. You know, the good old days. And while many mafioso also cite the golden age as a time of honor and loyalty, they argue that those times no longer exist. Now, everyone breaks the rules. Yeah, that's right. The mob has a strict set of rules, like a country club, with guns. First, you have to be a full-blooded Italian to join the gang, which, yeah, everyone knows that. John Panizzi, formerly of the Lucchese crime family, shared that mobsters aren't allowed to whack women and children, but they also can't be intentionally involved in lawsuits or even invest in the stock market. Imagine getting rolled up in a carpet for investing in Amazon. Because the Mafia was notorious for using explosive devices in Italy, mob soldiers were banned from using them in the US. But that didn't stop them from placing a bomb underneath Gambino underboss Frankie DeCicco's car in 1986. And despite observing a strict policy against drug dealing at the time, each of the 5 families has had at least one member tied to a drug-related business. The enterprise brings in too much money to prevent guys from dabbling. Remember in Goodfellas when Paulie tells Henry not to get involved in drugs because of the heavy prison sentences associated with them, and he does it anyway because it's just too much cash? Yeah, it's like that. Yeah, that was a good movie. Roles in the Mafia are highly specialized to ensure that no one person ever knows the full spectrum of a family's criminal enterprise. As a teen, you'll most likely drive other made men around as they do their business. Imagine getting excited for your first day in the mob only to realize you're a wise guy Uber. Entire families of blood relatives often join the syndicate under a particular profession, such as assassins or bodyguards. Or drivers, I guess. Capos, or captains, are often defined as the leaders of specific criminal activities in a detailed location. For instance, one capo may be in charge of everything west of a particular neighborhood block, while another would be in charge of illegal gambling. Suppose you're not officially inducted and are just an associate, or worse, a seasonal employee. Geez, might as well go work at the mall. In that case, you'll most likely remain in whatever position you had as a civilian, because that's the role that determined your usefulness to the family. These roles include, but are not limited to, bookkeepers, drug dealers, politicians, and law enforcement. When you're in the mob, La Familia takes priority over your actual familia. Women are rarely recruited into the business, and children from families with mafia ties usually recall later that they rarely saw their fathers. Instead of showing up for family picnics, little league games, or other family-related events, made men show their affection by giving their loved ones expensive gifts. Sometimes buying their love worked, but those kids who want a life outside of organized crime often resent that they grew up without their fathers around. Former made man Frankie DiMatteo, whose father and grandfather were involved in the Colombo Mafia, recalled what it was like growing up. By 10, you notice your uncles are a lot different from other people. They're whispering, and then there are people coming around and they dress differently than other families. By 12 or 13, I knew who everybody was. Speaking of kids, it's not uncommon for children to witness violence at a young age. Like the son of mobster Giuseppe DeCicco, who discovered the bodies of his 2 uncles when he was 11 years old, after hearing the gunshots that suddenly ended their lives. When the Mafia decides you're done, no matter how many of your nephews are around to see it. As bad as it was being the kid of a Mafia man, it was just as tough being the wife of one. And we don't just mean Carmela Soprano constantly wondering whether Tony was cheating on her. Some women who have tried to leave their mobster husbands have become victims of physical, emotional, and psychological abuse, kidnapping, and even murder. Consequently, it's not unheard of for former mob wives to go into hiding, or even take their own lives. The Mafia runs on funds, and those funds don't always come easily. Just because you're raking in the dough for the family business doesn't mean the organized crime hustle will make you rich. Most of the money goes back into the organization to pay off high-interest loans. And the work you do isn't quite as exciting as what you see in the movies. Wise guys are on call 24/7, and they don't get their paychecks automatically deposited in a bank account like a Best Buy employee. You get paid when the Don decides the job is finished. And while you can't expect to be paid for the overtime, you can expect to get your kneecaps tapped if you sit too close to a made man's wife during a job. Even though organized crime does have a documented connection with labor unions, wise guys can't exactly unionize. Because the mob hierarchy is specifically designed to keep bosses out of prison, most members have specific, mundane jobs that keep them from gaining too much information about the organization. Bosses expect bodyguards to be available at all times to protect their families, and can be called at a moment's notice. If you're a family associate, expect to do a lot of manual labor, which makes the 24-hour dress code seem all the more unreasonable. Don't worry though, you'll more likely be required to unload trucks than dispose of bodies. Although extortion, prostitution, and drug rings compromise some of the mob's income, they need bigger jobs to keep the cash flow steady and out of the public eye. Hijacking big rigs full of clothes and stereo equipment was one of notorious crime boss John Gotti's favorite ways to make a quick buck in his early days. However, these weren't Fast and Furious heists, or even Butch and Sundance heists. Mafioso would simply bribe truck drivers to misplace crates of goods for their associates to pick up later. That means if you're a low-level associate, much of your day-to-day is going to be backbreaking work loading and unloading contraband, like heavy jukeboxes and hundreds of cases of cigarettes. Frankly, at this point, prison isn't looking so bad. When you're in the mob, expect to follow a strict dress code. The type and style of clothing varies depending on which family you belong to, but you should always dress to impress, because if you don't look good, businessmen won't take you seriously. According to mob survivor Frank DiMatteo, there were two acceptable styles: a shirt and tie, or button-down knit shirts and sweaters for when you were in the club in the daytime. And never sneakers. No word on velour tracksuits. Well, at least when you get pinched doing all that waste management, you can relax your style, right? Wrong. Turns out you're expected to dress the part of a good fella even if you end up in prison. For instance, the Sagaria family wears Samsonite shoes with cashmere socks and designer clothes, even when locked in the slammer. Meanwhile, the Schiavone group requires its members to maintain impeccable grooming standards, with well-trimmed beards and absolutely no hair gel. But good news, tattoos are A-OK. What about a tattoo of a sneaker? Better not push your luck. Conducting all of your mafia business securely requires a surprising amount of tax forms and paperwork. After all, remember what happened to Al Capone. You can't just stash your money in a regular bank account. Instead, you need to launder it, which can get tedious. Bars that don't do well are the perfect place to hide extra income, because they deal with a lot of cash. So the money can move quietly through mob hands while the business makes relatively small tax contributions. Still, gangsters need a bunch of these shells in order to ensure the operation's success, meaning that each dive bar requires its own tax return. The more successful your underground business is, the more paperwork you'll have to complete for all your business fronts. Sounds like it's time to make H&R Block an offer they can't refuse. If you join one of the 5 families in the hopes of eventually becoming Don Corleone, it's unlikely you'll ever reach your career goals. Each gang in the Mafia is considered a family, and each family has roughly between 10 and 100 members. Each association has only one boss, followed by the underboss. Next in line come the captains, followed by the made men. Everyone else who works for the family is called an associate, and there is a big hierarchical gap between them and the rest of the crew. Dons must approve new family branches, and new groups are rare. The boss makes all the decisions for the entire syndicate, and, just like any other manager, also benefits from receiving most of the family income. Some underbosses occasionally make decisions without consulting their don, but the power they hold varies. Often the underboss serves as an apprentice in case his don gets too old to conduct meetings, is sentenced to prison, or gets sent to sleep with the fishes. They're like the vice president. Capos lead their own sections of the family and are often stationed in a specific geographic location. Soldiers conduct most of the dirty work and are considered the family's bottom members. Dons also employ associates, but they aren't made men and are usually just experienced robbers or dirty politicians. And because each person holds a specific job, moving up in the family ranks is rare. That's a real bulletproof glass ceiling. While Hollywood definitely takes liberties when creating mafia stories, some former wise guys claim that certain details of mob life are so accurate, the writers must have worked with made guys as consultants. And just like any other business arrangement, Hollywood and the mob share a mutually beneficial relationship. As classic films like The Godfather, Casino, and Goodfellas create intrigue and appeal for broader audiences, some mafioso have been able to capitalize on the mystique by sharing their experiences in the media. For example, recently, Sammy the Bull Gravano and Joe Panizzi both contributed to podcasts detailing their lives as gangsters, which is further proof that no one can resist telling their life story on a podcast. Despite having no formal education and a pretty serious criminal record dating back to the Prohibition era, legendary mob boss and casino owner Benny Binion had a tremendous impact on the history and development of Las Vegas, Nevada. A mass of contradictions, Binion was known as a nice guy, but also a dangerous and even deadly foe when crossed. Today, we're looking back on the strange life of gambling icon Benny Binion, the friendliest mobster in Las Vegas. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, sometimes 6 feet underground in Vegas. Lester Ben Binion, who'd later go by Benny, was born in 1904 and grew up in the Dallas suburb of Pilot Grove, Texas. He'd keep in touch with his Texas roots all his life, famously wearing cowboy shirts and hats nearly every day, and even walking around the streets of Vegas armed with a pistol. You know, back when that was unusual. Binion was often sick as a child, and his parents assumed he likely wouldn't live into adulthood, so education was not their top priority. By his own account, he never progressed in school beyond the 2nd grade. But his health gradually improved around age 10, and young Benny began to go on business trips with his father, who was a horse trader. They probably were not the most exciting trips, unless they trade horses the same way they pick contestants on American Gladiators. These trips were the beginning of Binion's education in gambling, as cards and other games of chance were a popular pastime among traders, farmers, and merchants during downtime at county fairs and trade shows. He also occasionally would take side gigs as a mule dealer, which apparently trained young Benny in the art of deal-making and salesmanship, and slinging mules, although that particular skill was less useful for his career in the mob. Binion's criminal career started at around age 18, when he moved to El Paso and started working for a Prohibition-era moonshine racket. It was a solid entry-level crime gig. At first, he had minor responsibilities, like spreading gravel, which is apparently something you still have to do, even when you join the mob. But thanks to his cleverness and bravado, he gradually moved up in the organization. Underworld legend has it that he once stole an entire stash of booze from a police evidence vault by getting the cops drunk and having a spare copy of their keys made. Whether or not things actually went down that way, that's a pretty good story. They probably whipped that one out during recruitment drives. The mob does job fairs, right? By 1928, Binion's notoriety in the criminal world was on the rise. He was still moving moonshine on the side, but had also started up his own small-time illegal gambling operation by running a local numbers game. A man named Warren Diamond, a well-known figure in illegal gambling in Dallas, took Binion under his wing and taught him not just about running numbers, but what to do with his earnings and how to carry himself in public. If Binion's later persona was any indication, Diamond's advice on how to carry oneself in public was like an armed cowboy. More on that in a second. When Diamond passed away in 1933, Binion stepped in as his successor. Around that time, Binion came into conflict with Frank Bolding, the manager of a rival bootlegging operation, which is another way of saying that Binion blasted him into the next world. As Binion initially recalled the incident, the two men sat down for dinner to hash out their differences, but started arguing. Bolding then jumped out of his seat and brandished a knife, prompting Binion to pull out his pistol and fire. Binion later admitted this version wasn't true, and his rival never actually held a knife. That's a pretty major detail, Benny. Nonetheless, he maintained for the rest of his life that he had feared for his safety and shot Bolding in self-defense. He was convicted of the slaying but received just a 2-year suspended sentence. As a more long-term consequence of the shooting, his quick-draw skills earned Binion the nickname The Cowboy. As you might expect with any mob guy called The Cowboy, this was not the only untimely demise with which Binion was directly involved. On September 12, 1936, he got into a territorial skirmish with a game operator in Dallas named Ben Frieden. According to a report in the Dallas Times-Herald, Binion and an associate named H.E. Buddy Malone fatally shot Frieden. Listen, Who among us hasn't been in a gunfight with a man named He-Buddy? During the conflict, Binion allegedly also shot himself in the shoulder, allowing him to later claim that Frieden had been armed and he was acting in self-defense. Regardless of who really put the bullet in Binion's shoulder, he was successful in convincing a court that he had taken out Frieden in self-defense. So both Binion and his buddy walked away scot-free. Binion also had bad blood with another Dallas gambler by the name of Herbert the Cat Noble. Man, some really great nicknames all around. Originally, Noble served as a bodyguard for another gambler named Sam Murray, who was ultimately whacked by another associate of both men. That happens a lot in the mob. After the whacking, Noble took over Murray's business and was supposed to continue paying Binion a cut of their profits. Instead, Noble pulled another tried-and-true underworld move and double-crossed Binion. He recruited one of Binion's own lieutenants, Raymond Laudermilk, to come work for him instead and help scale up his operation. The duo went in together on a new venture called the Airmen's Club. Binion was not thrilled with the new competition and allegedly demanded that Laudermilk and Noble begin turning over 40% of their profits to him, roughly twice the payment he normally took. When they told him to get bent, Binion reportedly started making attempts on Noble's life, including one incident that led to a daring high-speed chase which landed Noble in the hospital. By some accounts, Binion tried to have Herbert Noble whacked on 11 separate occasions. Look, he was really upset about being left out of the Airmen's Club. The attempts on Noble's life were so intense that his wife was accidentally taken out by a car bomb in 1949 that was intended for him. Noble's ticket was finally punched in 1951 by an exploding mailbox, of all things. Despite his, let's call it, enthusiasm for violence, Benny Binion was also taking some more practical steps to grow his business. In 1936, he started hosting private dice games at hotels around the Dallas area, including the Southland Hotel in downtown Dallas, which came to serve as his headquarters. The 8-story building featured a coffee shop where he could hold court, bellhops and other staffers who could serve as runners, mules, and personal assistants, and of course, ample rooms which could support a growing prostitution ring. Collectively, the entire operation came to be known as the Southland Syndicate. By the 1940s, Binion was unquestionably one of the top criminals in Dallas, running numbers games and illegal casinos through his own network of bookies around the city, and even serving as the personal gambling coordinator for wealthy Texans like Howard Hughes and oil magnate H.L. Hunt. As World War II raged overseas, Binion's focus was entirely domestic. He wanted to expand his organization from Dallas into Fort Worth. A combination of factors, including the loss of political connections in the local government and encroachment on his territory by the Chicago outfit, ultimately drove Binion out of Texas entirely. In 1946, he left his home state and moved to Las Vegas. Upon arriving in the desert, Binion invested in a few casinos and opened one of his own, the Westerner Gambling House and Saloon. But none of his early projects ever paid off. He frequently ran into licensing problems and conflicts with his partners and co-investors. In fairness, it seems like he may have been difficult to work with. In 1951, Binion purchased Vegas's El Dorado Club and Apache Hotel, renaming them Binion's Horseshoe and bringing in a lot of foot traffic by allowing extremely high limits on bets. His initial table limit for craps was $500, which was pretty high stakes back then. That was like super yacht money.
Snake eyes! Snake eyes?
Oh no! I'm ruined!
For a time, the Horseshoe's policy was to essentially allow bets of any size, so long as your subsequent bets weren't larger than your initial wager.
Put it on black!
It's red.
Eventually, other casinos were forced to increase their own table limits in order to keep up with Binion. The cowboy was behind a number of other innovations that have become commonplace and even expected when visiting Las Vegas today. He was the first casino in downtown Vegas to replace old-fashioned sawdust floors with classier carpeting. He's also credited with the idea of offering limo rides and comps drinks to players in order to encourage them to spend more time at the tables. While skipping on showgirls and other gaudy touches favored by his competitors, Binion was generous with his players, offering benefits like $2 stake specials and promotional stunts like 100 times odds craps games. The strategy paid off and made the Horseshoe one of the most profitable casinos in Vegas. Personally, however, Binion suffered a number of setbacks. Within 1 year of opening the Horseshoe, he was convicted of tax evasion and was ultimately sentenced to 5 years at the Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. To help cover his legal fees and back taxes, Binion was forced to sell a majority share of the casino to a fellow Texan, oil baron Joe W. Brown. He didn't regain full control of the horseshoe until 1964. In the years after Binion retook control of the horseshoe, it became ground zero for one of Las Vegas's signature events, the World Series of Poker. You know, the thing Chili shows on ESPN when nothing else is on. The event was originally known as the Texas Gamblers Reunion, which was started in Reno by Bill and LaFane Moore. After putting together the events for a few years, the Moores turned the tradition over to Binion. Binion renamed the event the World Series of Poker and opened it up to amateur gamblers and members of the public rather than just close friends and insiders.
194 players paid $10,000 each to enter this competition.
By 1973, CBS Sports was airing the games on television. In 1991, the World Series of Poker awarded its first $1 million prize. Binion was also instrumental in moving the Wrangler National Finals Rodeo to Las Vegas in 1985. Despite never professionally riding a horse in his entire life, he was introduced into the Pro Rodeo Hall of Fame for his efforts. Not bad, cowboy. Binion was never legally able to hold a gaming license in Nevada following his tax crimes in the 1950s, so his son Jack ran the company as casino president. Binion's sons continued to serve as the face of the horseshoe throughout the 1970s and 80s, along with their mother, Teddy Jane, who often worked in the cashier's cage. In 2004, the horseshoe was seized by federal agents for failing to keep up with union dues and benefits. Come on, it was always going to end this way. It was ultimately sold to Harrah's Entertainment, which later sold it again to a company named TLC Casino Enterprises, which also owns the nearby Four Queens. The World Series of Poker is still played there to this day.
And I am stoked!
Binion succumbed to heart failure on Christmas Day 1989 at the age of 85. He was introduced into the Poker Hall of Fame the following year. The man is in a surprising number of those. Famous criminals Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker both came from families that wound up struggling to make ends meet during the Great Depression. United by a shared ambition for fame and fortune, the two became lovers and embarked on a crime spree. They held up stores and banks from Texas to Minnesota, gaining themselves wealth and notoriety, and bringing excitement and entertainment to the down-and-out people of America. They lived a fast and wild life on the wrong side of the law, and eventually, it caught up with them. Today, we're going to take a look at the timeline of Bonnie and Clyde's crime spree. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker and Clyde Chestnut Barrow, yeah, his middle name was Chestnut, first met in early 1930. The 19-year-old Bonnie Parker was already married at the time, but her husband was in prison and they were estranged. The marriage did little to discourage her nascent romance with Clyde Barrow. In fact, the attraction between the two was so strong it survived a prison sentence he incurred shortly after they met. While he was doing the time, he even made a ring for her. You have to admit, that is kind of sweet. Only 21 years old, Clyde Barrow had already committed a long list of misdeeds. Just a few short weeks after meeting Bonnie, he was sentenced to a term at Eastham Prison Farm. It wasn't his first stay behind bars, and it wouldn't be his last. Already willing to do anything for him, Bonnie helped him escape by smuggling a gun inside the prison. Clyde did make it out, but he was quickly hunted down and thrown back in prison. He would remain in the pen for another 2 years, finally being paroled in 1932. Not surprisingly, prison didn't do much in the way of reforming Clyde. If anything, he came out an even more hardened criminal. Once he was released, he assembled a loosely affiliated band of outlaws who helped him rob banks, small stores, and gas stations. With the exception of Bonnie, the members of what came to be known as the Barrow Gang changed over time. Although mostly famous for robberies, the group is also believed to be responsible for a series of slayings in 1932. Victims included both police and civilians. The group was prolific, but not always successful. On one occasion, Bonnie even ended up in jail after an attempted robbery at a store in Texas. During her 2 months behind bars, Bonnie wrote poetry to pass the time. However, like Clyde, she wasn't rehabilitated one bit. Upon release, she returned to Clyde and back to her infamous criminal lifestyle. Though primarily remembered for all the banks they robbed, the story of the Barrow Gang took a bloody detour in April of 1932. One of the group's members had shot and killed a Texas jeweler named John Butcher while attempting to rob his store. Butcher's wife was an eyewitness, and when questioned by the police, she identified Clyde Barrow as one of the culprits. The violence continued into the summer of 1932. While visiting Oklahoma, Clyde and an associate named Raymond Hamilton were approached by a sheriff and his deputy. According to news reports, Barrow and Hamilton opened fire without warning. The sheriff was killed and the deputy was wounded. Over the next 2 years, the Barrow Gang would continue to commit a string of brutal acts against officers of the law. Thankfully, these confrontations weren't always deadly. In fact, Bonnie and Clyde were just as likely to take a policeman alive as they were to take one out. By 1933, the Barrow Gang was becoming well known. Between just the months of April and July of that year, they were involved in several serious standoffs with the law. In early April, Clyde's brother Buck and sister-in-law Blanche joined the gang, and the group laid low in an apartment in Joplin, Missouri. However, on April 13th, police located and surrounded the unit. As usual, Bonnie and Clyde chose to shoot their way out. 2 police officers were killed during their escape. In July of '33, the gang went to Platte City, Missouri, where they tried to keep a low profile. However, that proved difficult in the small town. Blanche later recalled that everyone seemed to act as though she might open fire on them at any minute. When the police inevitably knocked on their front door, a woman's voice told them that she would open it as soon as she was dressed. It's unknown if that voice belonged to Bonnie or Blanche, but it doesn't matter. A moment later, the gang opened fire on the squad of officers. The entire Barrow Gang escaped, although Blanche and Buck were injured. Living as a fugitive meant having to be prepared to flee a location quickly, even if valuable objects were left behind. When Bonnie and Clyde fled one of their Joplin hideouts, police found rolls of undeveloped film and Bonnie's handwritten poems. A local paper published the photos, which only made the couple more famous and stoked the public's image of them as rebellious but romantic lovers. Bonnie and Clyde were not skittish about ending anyone who stood in their way, whether it was a cop or a civilian. On the other hand, they weren't bloodthirsty either. The gang would often take hostages and later release them safely. 2 such hostages were an undertaker named H.D. Darby and a woman named Sophie Stone. Darby and Stone were abducted when Bonnie and Clyde commandeered their car in Louisiana. At first, the outlaws were rough with the captives, but they quickly softened their attitude. By the time they dropped the terrified couple off in Arkansas, Clyde was feeling so apologetic he offered them $5 for their troubles and even invited the undertaker to embalm him when he died. When you're always on the run from the fuzz, you spend a lot of time in your car making quick getaways. Dangerous driving, as your auto insurance provider will tell you, makes a crash inevitable, and it finally happened to Bonnie and Clyde in the summer of 1933. Clyde was driving when the car went off the road. Everyone inside was injured. According to Blanche's later recollections, Bonnie suffered severe burns and had cuts on her leg, right arm, and face. His chin was said to be skinned to the bone, and her chest was caved in, although luckily no ribs were broken. The whole gang thought she would be dead by morning. Amazingly, Bonnie pulled through and survived the injuries, but she never fully recovered from them. Just a few short days after they survived a raid in Platte City, Missouri, the gang found themselves facing down the police once again. Bonnie, Clyde, Blanche, and Buck had fled to Iowa, where they sought refuge at a closed amusement park. When the police inevitably caught up with the foursome, Bonnie and Clyde managed to escape with their lives. Buck and Blanche, however, were not so lucky. The police fired on Buck, hitting him several times. Blanche opted to stay with her husband and was arrested. Buck didn't make it. He died at the hospital. Over the course of the crime spree, several of Bonnie and Clyde's associates were captured by the police. In fact, Raymond Hamilton, who had helped Clyde dispose of a sheriff in Oklahoma in 1932, was himself in custody at Eastham. Having served time at the same facility several years earlier, Clyde was familiar with their procedures. So, on January 16, 1934, Bonnie and Clyde were able to free Hamilton and several other inmates by firing upon the prison guards in a field. On April 2, 1934, everything changed. Bonnie and Clyde, whose exploits had made them popular with the public at large, killed 2 Texas police officers who had approached their car. That crime quickly turned public opinion against the outlaw couple. No longer were they seen as rebellious, romantic anti-heroes. Instead, the cold-bloodedness of the incident cast the pair in a much darker light. Bonnie and Clyde finally met their fate on a stretch of highway in rural Louisiana. Having received a tip as to the couple's whereabouts and likely destination, the police were able to set up an ambush. 6 officers from 3 different law enforcement agencies were involved. They waited for Bonnie and Clyde at the side of the road and opened fire on their car as it passed. Fred Hamer, one of the lawmen who was on the scene that day, reported that despite the fact both were clutching their sidearms when the trap was sprung, neither Clyde nor Bonnie was able to get off even a single shot. Footage taken that day shows that the car was hit by 112 bullets, about a quarter of which are believed to have hit the infamous couple. The coroner would ultimately report that Clyde had 17 bullet wounds and Bonnie had 26. A crowd quickly gathered at the scene as the news spread. Bonnie and Clyde were set on by souvenir seekers who ghoulishly cut locks of hair and bits of clothing from them. The dramatic end of Bonnie and Clyde was front-page news from coast to coast. Both were returned to Texas for burial. Spectators lined up outside the funeral homes by the thousands, merely to get a glimpse of the notorious bandits. Sadly, though they were virtually inseparable in life, Bonnie and Clyde's families decided to bury them separately. Approximately 20,000 people showed up to see Bonnie laid to rest. As one of the most infamous outlaw couples of all time, Bonnie and Clyde remain legendary in the annals of American crime and pop culture. They've been the subject of numerous books, including one by Blanche Barrow herself, songs, including ones by Mel Torme and Merle Haggard, and movies, including 1967's Bonnie and Clyde, starring Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty, as well as Netflix's 2019 film, The Highwaymen. More tellingly, Bonnie and Clyde's very name survive in the idiomatic phrase, modern-day Bonnie and Clyde, which is still used to refer to couples who operate together as criminals. Anyone who has ever seen Martin Scorsese's 1995 hit film Casino knows that Las Vegas was built by the Mafia. But few realize those formative years were also steered by a vastly different group with vastly different interests. Mormonism has deep roots in the city of Las Vegas. Mormons built the first settlements on the site and were largely responsible for creating its casino culture. Today, we're going to take a look at the untold story of how the Mormon Mafia built Las Vegas into what it is today. Founded on April 6, 1830 in the state of New York, what would eventually become known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was originally called the Church of Christ. The teachings of the church were based on the Book of Mormon, which purported to be a chronicle of Jesus Christ's ministry in the Western Hemisphere. The contents of the book were alleged to be translated from a series of golden plates that Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, had discovered. Over the next decade, the church moved further west to avoid religious persecution, and in 1844, Joseph Smith was killed by a mob in Chicago. Leadership of the church was thereafter assumed by one of his underlings, Brigham Young. Following in Smith's footsteps, Young continued to move the church west, until in 1847, they finally settled in what would eventually become the state of Utah. By the 20th century, the Church of Latter-day Saints was growing into a massive international organization, with vast resources and real political power. The first permanent settlement in Las Vegas was erected by representatives of the Mormon Church. It was in 1855 that they were sent by church leader Brigham Young to establish an outpost halfway between the Mormon missions in San Bernardino and Southern California. The purpose of the outpost was mainly to store supplies, but while they were headed in that direction, these same representatives were asked to convert any Paiute Native Americans they happened to come across in the region. A fort was constructed, but despite the group's best efforts, the Mormons' first attempt to settle the region failed hard. Between crops that wouldn't grow and disagreements over group leadership, the settlement soon collapsed, and the Mormons abandoned the fort by 1857. They couldn't know it then, but the Mormons had actually planted the seeds for what would eventually grow into one of the 25 largest cities in the United States. The remains of that original fort still exist in the city. and can be seen today at the corner of Las Vegas Boulevard and Washington Avenue. In 1905, the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad bought up much of the property around the tiny town of Las Vegas. 110 acres of that land, adjacent to the Union Railroad, was then auctioned off. It's that parcel, which today sits in the downtown area, that formed the basis for what was eventually incorporated into the city of Las Vegas in 1911. Thanks to the railway, the rural settlement began to flourish, and Mormons returned to the region. They built homes in nearby Bunkerville, St. Thomas, Mesquite, and Overton, and eventually gravitated to Las Vegas as well. By 1930, Mormons comprised almost 10% of the population of Las Vegas. In 1954, the Mormon contingent was still relatively small, but the Mormon-dominated Continental Bank of Salt Lake City nonetheless decided to open the Bank of Las Vegas. E. Perry Thomas, a Mormon-connected financial manager employed by Continental in Utah, was sent to run the new institution. Thomas is noteworthy because he became the first banker to start lending money to the folks who would soon come to run the town with an iron fist: casino operators. Whether they were actually criminals or not, these operators had an unsavory reputation due to their connections with the traditionally organized crime-controlled area of gambling. When asked about the risks that came along with dealing with such clients, Thomas would simply respond that he was in the banking business, and regardless of what business they were in, the casino people were good loans. Thomas's decision led to a quick increase in the size and number of Las Vegas casinos. He also fought to change rules that prohibited corporate ownership of casinos, presumably because corporate borrowers were also good loans. This would also bring the casinos under the jurisdiction of the SEC, or Securities and Exchange Commission, which would effectively become overseers of the casino business. This would ensure that mobsters and organized crime types could no longer use casinos as fronts for laundering money. They say that in the 1940s and 50s, Las Vegas was run by the Mafia, and that is completely true. But in the 1960s, a new player came to town: Howard Hughes. Hughes was a celebrity businessman, film producer, and aviator. He was a titan of American industry, but towards the end of his life, he was also an increasingly unwell man, prone to extremely eccentric behavior. On Thanksgiving weekend in 1966, Hughes arrived in Las Vegas by train and took up residence at the Desert Inn. He stayed there for a month, never once leaving his room. Eventually, the owner of the hotel threatened to kick Hughes out. Hughes didn't want to leave, so he bought the hotel. That's the kind of thing you can do to end an argument when you're Howard Hughes. Needless to say, he continued to stay holed up on the hotel's top floor. After that, he started buying up Las Vegas casinos left and right, snatching them right out of the hands of the mob. However, since he never left the Desert Inn, he needed a team of executive assistants and advisors to oversee his business dealings. This team was led by a man named Frank Gay, who was curiously known as Bill. Gay was a Mormon that Hughes had hired right out of UCLA. Hughes preferred working with Mormons because he knew they didn't drink, smoke, or gamble. He thought this made them more likely to avoid being tempted by the vices of Vegas and handle his business with greater discretion and integrity. Hughes was so committed to using Mormons that they wound up composing the entirety of Gay's team. The group quickly became known around town as the Mormon Mafia. By the mid-1960s, Las Vegas was heavily influenced by people who were either members of or associated with various American mafias. While Mormon businessmen had been the ones to encourage the growth of the relatively shady gambling business, they were simultaneously concerned about what it was doing to the city's image. They eventually realized that the solution was to arrange for the mob-owned casinos to be purchased by someone with a more legitimate image, someone like Howard Hughes. Worried that if his involvement was generally known, he would get gouged on the purchase prices, Hughes' casino buying spree was ultimately enabled by E. Perry Thomas, who had posed as the buyer in Hughes' stead. His involvement remained a secret, and by the time that secret got out, the billionaire aviator already owned over a dozen properties in the town. In the late 1960s, future casino magnate Steve Wynn was a small-time investor in real estate and a minority owner of the Frontier Hotel. Wynn became a protege of E. Perry Thomas, who eventually helped him acquire his first big Las Vegas property, the downtown Golden Nugget Casino. Wynn had a knack for the casino business, and he would go on to acquire or build many of the city's most famous casinos, including Treasure Island, the Mirage, and the Bellagio. Even today, Steve Wynn remains one of the international gambling industry's most high-profile and successful figures. E. Perry Thomas's main job may have been to buy casinos on behalf of Howard Hughes, but that's not all he did. Thomas also spearheaded a change in Nevada state law that would allow corporations to own and operate casinos. Up until the 1960s, only individuals could be licensed to own or operate a casino. The law was intended to make it clear exactly who was responsible for the ownership and operation of the casino, theoretically making it much harder for criminals and other undesirables from getting a foothold in the industry. However, like a lot of things, this worked much better in theory than it did in reality. The mob was able to skirt the law by hiring clean frontmen who could conceal the operation's more sinister backers. Thomas realized that corporate ownership would not only greatly increase the growth of the city, it would bring with it the scrutiny of the Securities and Exchange Commission. This would act as an additional filter to underworld influence and further bolster the image of Las Vegas as a legitimate tourist destination. Thomas turned out to be right on the money. The law had massive repercussions for the future of the city. As one historian put it, without it, Vegas would still be in the Dark Ages. If you know anything about Mormons, you know that they are traditionally opposed to what they perceive as sinful activities, like gambling. In their eyes, gambling is viewed as sinful because it's akin to acquiring money from someone without giving anything of value in return. Nonetheless, this outlook didn't stop the Mormons from helping turn Las Vegas into the largest gambling destination in the United States. In fact, many of them even work in casinos. How is this apparent contradiction resolved? Well, the church's stance seems to be pretty simple. Don't touch the dice. If you need even more proof of the Mormon Church's traditional power in Las Vegas, look no further than the local political scene. In 1940, Berkeley Bunker was appointed to the U.S. Senate to fill a vacancy left by the death of the former officeholder. Bunker, a native of Clark County, the county in which Las Vegas is situated, was the former Speaker of the Nevada State Assembly, as well as the first Mormon senator from Nevada. More recently, Democrat Harry Reid represented Nevada in Washington, D.C. However, Mormon politicians from Nevada tend to be conservative, and they tend to stay in office a long time. In 1920, the United States passed Prohibition and banned the sale of alcoholic beverages. While the supply of liquor was shut down, demand still existed and organized crime stepped in to fill the void. The age of the bootlegger had begun. Alphonse Gabriel Al Capone was 25 years old when he became the boss of the Chicago Rackets, one of the 20th century's most infamous cultural figures. By the time he was done, Capone's name would become practically synonymous with organized crime itself. Today, we're going to recount the things you didn't know about Al Capone. If there's one thing Americans love, it's a good rags to riches story, even if the middle of that story happens to be filled with kidnapping, bootlegging, and whacking guys. Along those lines, Al Capone started from near the bottom of society. He was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1899. His parents were Italian-American immigrants, and the family lived in a rundown tenement near the naval yards. As such, the area was always rife with sailors and soldiers searching for booze and prostitutes. However, Capone's roots weren't quite what you would have imagined. His father, originally from Naples, was cosmopolitan and highly educated. The family was considered professional and respectable. Indeed, for the early years of life, Al himself had no trouble walking the straight and narrow path. It wasn't until his teen years that his dangerous side began to emerge. He slowly began to transform into a delinquent at the age of 14, and at the age of 14 is reported to have hit a female teacher in his school. That Donnybrook got him expelled. At the time, New York City was awash with street gangs like the Hudson Dusters and the Gopher Gang. Wow, gangster names used to be so cool. Capone joined up with the city's infamous 5 Points Gang. He excelled at his work and eventually found his way into organized crime via an association with Johnny Torrio, a powerful boss who, like Capone's father, hailed from Naples. Al Capone's underworld nickname was Scarface, which is so badass it literally inspired at least 3 movies all by itself. So how did he get it? Well, after getting kicked out of school, Capone found work as a bouncer in a local club called the Harvard Inn. The story goes that one night while he was working the door, Al took a liking to a woman named Lina Galluccio. He offered to take her for a walk on the beach, but she wasn't interested. Not one to take no for an answer, Al kept after her and later in the evening shouted to her that he liked her backside. Al meant it as a compliment, but Lina's brother Frank Galluccio didn't take it as such. Frank wasn't as big as Al, but he did have a knife, which he used to carve Capone across the face 3 times. It took 80 stitches to close the wounds, and the lines left behind would lay the groundwork for one of the most famous nicknames in the history of crime. While the world may have called him Scarface, Al's friends had another, slightly less threatening nickname for him, Snorky. Yes, you heard that right, Snorky. One of the most dangerous mob bosses in the history of the world was known to his friends as Snorky. Why? Because in 1920s Chicago, Snorky was gang slang for a sharp dresser, and Capone had a weakness for expensive imported Italian suits. History also records that his friends occasionally called him the Big Fellow, but that one really doesn't need much explaining. Al Capone liked nice things. Besides his fondness for custom-made suits, when Capone started making bank, he spent a great deal of it on his clothes. In fact, Capone was known to shell out in the neighborhood of $500 for his outfits. That might not seem like a lot, but converted from 1920-era prices, that's the modern-day equivalent of almost $7,000. Of course, if you're spending that much on your outfit, you probably wouldn't want to see it get all ripped up with bullet holes and stained with gangster juice. Neither did Al. So to protect his suits, and presumably also his life, he had a 1928 Cadillac V8 town sedan reinforced with armor plating. The car was loaded with 3,000 pounds of steel plates and bulletproof glass windows, essentially making it the equivalent of a tank. And in a twist that would make James Bond jealous, the car had a few other cool extras, including holes cut in the rear and sides of the car so that he and his henchmen could shoot back at attackers without having to come out from behind the armor. Capone was the OG Pimp My Ride. Golfing with the boss is an American tradition, and the mob was no exception. Capone and his men loved to go golfing, and while they enjoyed the game, what they really enjoyed more was raising a little hell. The Capone gang was reported to have drank heavily on the course and bet ridiculous amounts of money on almost anything. They were also known to keep guns in their golf bags, because when you were with a gangster in the 1920s Chicago, a shootout could break out at almost any time, anywhere. On one outing in September of 1928, Capone hit the links with fellow mobster Fred the Killer Burke, Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, and Machine Gun Jack McGurn. Capone went searching through his bag for a particular club and accidentally grabbed his revolver. It fired a shot, and Capone was rushed to St. Margaret's Hospital. He was registered under the assumed name Al Geary to keep a low profile, and presumably because he didn't want anyone to know how clumsy he was. Capone spent money like it was water. He bought fancy suits, expensive jewels, high-tech cars with armor and gadgets, and yet he never ran out of cash. Indeed, as a Chicago boss with interests in racketeering, gambling, prostitution, bootlegging, and vices of every imaginable kind, Capone was able to amass a staggering amount of money. In fact, Capone is believed to have earned in the area of $100 million a year, and that was in the 1920s. Adjusted for inflation to 2020 dollars, Al Capone's fortune would today be worth somewhere north of $1.3 billion. Yes, that's billion with a B, making Al something like the Jeff Bezos of crime. To maintain his iron grip on crime in Chicago, Al Capone had one simple task: take out anyone who dared get in his way. It didn't matter if you were a customer or a competitor. If you messed with the big fellow, you weren't long for this world. Of course, when you whack that many people, it's bound to raise a few questions. Al had that covered, though. To keep his men out of jail and safe from prosecution, Capone put unprecedented numbers of police officers, politicians, lawyers, and judges on his payroll. He spent millions each year on bribes to keep the establishment on his side and out of his way. When it came to crime, Al Capone had a keen mind, but it would fail him over the course of his life. At the age of 18, Al had contracted syphilis and never bothered to receive medical attention. Untreated, the effects of the disease were severe. It slowly eroded his mind, and by the 1940s, he was reported to have the intellectual capacity of a 7-year-old. In prison, he required special care and was known to lash out at nurses and mumble to himself. Near the end of his life, he was reported to be little more than a shell of his former self. It sounds like a story from a Hollywood movie. Two brothers go down separate paths. One becomes an infamous bootlegger, and the other a Prohibition task force member bent on bringing the bootleggers down. Yet, this was the reality of the Capone family. Born 7 years prior to his famous brother, James Vincenzo Capone went off to fight in World War I and lost contact with his family. When he came back from the front, he moved to the Midwestern United States and pulled a Don Draper, changing his name to Richard Hart. Richard Hart became marshal of a town called Homer, Nebraska, where he led numerous raids against bootleggers. Marshal Hart was the type of man who preferred subterfuge to direct action, where Treasury agents like Elliot Ness would take on the gangsters by kicking in the front door with guns ablazing. Hart preferred to wear disguises and catch the bad guys in the act. When he wasn't running his bootlegging empire, bribing cops and judges, or ordering the murder of his competitors, Capone was known to be a great philanthropist. Whether it was all just a public relations move or whether he actually enjoyed helping the needy out is unknown. But in his time, Capone developed a lasting reputation as a man of the people. During the Great Depression, he opened some of Chicago's first soup kitchens, was even known to go in and help feed the poor himself. Like many other famous gangsters, he was also famous for being a good tipper. When you think of Al Capone, you think of illegal beer, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and Robert De Niro's performance in The Untouchables. But you probably never think of milk. Yet, according to the Capone family, Al and his brother Ralph extensively lobbied the Chicago City Council to pass a law requiring all milk bottles to bear an expiration date. The story goes that one of the relatives became sick after drinking spoiled milk, and Al vowed to do something about it. Strangely, this isn't where Capone's milk obsession ends. He also invested in dairy, which he let his brother-in-law partially run. His brother Ralph was so heavily involved, he acquired the nickname Bottles. Being vicious and brutal was par for the course as a criminal in 1920s Chicago, but what made Capone different from his competitors was that he loved the spotlight. Gangsters of the time typically avoided publicity, but Capone enjoyed wearing flashy suits and jewels and publicly flaunting the highly illegal activities he engaged in. Capone was so obsessed with his public image that he even hired his own press agent when he was on trial for federal crimes. Interestingly, that press agent was the writer Damon Runyon, whose stories would go on to form the basis of the Broadway musical Guys and Dolls. Despite being loved by the public and having half the city officials on his payroll, Capone was eventually caught. In 1931, he was convicted of tax evasion and sent to serve time at a federal prison in Atlanta. However, the prison couldn't control him. Capone bribed guards and managed to maintain his influence even from behind bars. Not to be outdone, the government transferred Capone to Alcatraz in 1934. The Rock was famous for its strict security, and Capone's reputation didn't help him there. The guards were indifferent to him, and his fellow inmates didn't fear him. One even stabbed him with a pair of barber shears. It was here that the long-term effects of his syphilis began to emerge. In 1939, his mind mostly gone, Capone was transferred to Terminal Island Prison in California. He served out the rest of his sentence and was granted parole later that year. The rest of his life was spent battling the disease, which he finally succumbed to in 1947. For most of us, our knowledge of the Mafia begins and ends with Hollywood. From The Godfather to Goodfellas to The Sopranos. There's a sort of romantic allure around the Mafia. Made men who scrap their way from nothing into a long line of dons and crime families. It's all about the money, the power, and a somewhat paradoxical code of honor. But the real story of the Mafia is much more intricate. A painting with colors of violence, loyalty, and a sprinkling of bootlegging on top. It stretches back centuries and crosses continents. From the sun-baked hills of Sicily to the bustling streets of New York City. So, today we're taking our seat at the table with the history of the 5 families. The real-life story of the Godfather. Starting in Sicily's picturesque, olive tree-dotted lands, a group of men decided they had had enough of the local government's arrogance. They formed groups to protect their communities from those in power, which sounds really nice and noble, until you realize their protection involved coercion, extortion, and the occasional broken bone. By the mid-1800s, these groups expanded and then blended into one another to become the Sicilian Mafia. Around the same time in Naples, the Camorra crime family was stirring from the shadows of prison cells, ready to get out and join the fray of criminal activities. Fast forward a few decades, and as Italians began pouring into the United States, many made their homes in the melting pot of New York City. Neapolitans gravitated towards Brooklyn, while the Sicilians settled in Harlem and Manhattan. Inevitably, their crime ventures would cross paths and escalate into what became known as the First Mafia War. The Camorra and Sicilian factions were at one another's throats. Each traded blows until Don Pellegrino Morano of the Camaristas lured Nicholas Morello, the Sicilian leader, to a supposed peace meeting in 1916. But the ceasefire was one-sided, and Morano killed the Sicilian leader and his guard. This would inevitably fuel Morano's downfall when his own man, Ralph Daniello, turned Morano in for the murder. In the aftermath, the Sicilian Mafia became the dominant force, absorbing the scraps of the Camorra into their ranks. Amid all that chaos and violence, a man named Giuseppe Joe Masseria emerged. Masseria had been involved in crime most of his life in his native Italy. Eventually, fleeing a murder charge in Sicily, he landed in New York in 1903 and joined the notorious Morello gang, who had emerged as the city's first major crime family. Masseria's rise was nothing short of meteoric, and when Giuseppe Morello and Ignazio the Wolf Lupo were sent to prison during the 1910s, he saw an opportunity. Salvatore Toto d'Aquila, another leading figure in the Morello gang, became the self-declared boss of all bosses, or capo di tutti capi. However, Masseria was not one to be outshone. By the early 1920s, after numerous attempts on his life, Masseria had firmly established himself as Joe the Boss and earned the entirely too accurate nickname, the man who could dodge bullets. His rival D'Aquila was eliminated in 1928, with a little help from Masseria's ally, Charles Lucky Luciano. With D'Aquila out of the picture, Masseria took over as capo di tutti capi. But it turns out, getting to the top of an organized crime family is like coming in second at a pie-eating contest. Masseria just replaced one rival with another, and found himself dealing with Salvatore Maranzano, a new player in town from Sicily who would soon turn everything on its head. Maranzano had been sent by his boss, Don Vito Ferro, to expand their influence in the United States. He set up shop in Brooklyn, built a thriving real estate and bootlegging business, and quickly amassed a loyal following among fellow Sicilians. By 1930, tensions between Maranzano and Masseria's group were sky-high, leading to the infamous Castellamarese War. This wasn't just a small scrap between neighborhood rivals. It was an all-out war for control of the Mafia's future in New York. Initially, Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese supported Masseria, but as Maranzano gained the upper hand, they saw the writing on the wall. Luciano struck a deal with Maranzano, and on April 15, 1931, Masseria met his end at a Coney Island restaurant, leaving Maranzano to emerge victorious. With Masseria out of the picture, Maranzano called a meeting of the underworld elite, laying the groundwork for what would become La Cosa Nostra, Italian for our thing. He divided New York's organized crime into the 5 families: Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese. Each family was structured like a military unit with a boss at the top, followed by an underboss, a consigliere or trusted advisor, and a host of capos, soldiers, and associates. Maranzano's reign as capo di tutti capi was short-lived, however. Luciano, who had no intention of playing second fiddle, orchestrated Maranzano's assassination in September 1931, using hitmen borrowed from his friend Meyer Lansky. With Maranzano out of the way, Luciano abolished the title of boss of all bosses and established the Commission, a governing body to oversee the Mafia's operations across the United States. This was organized crime's version of the United Nations, ensuring disputes were settled without bloodshed, as much as organized crime can be without bloodshed. With their powers consolidated, the 1930s saw the 5 families expand their criminal enterprises. Joseph Joe Bananas Bonanno, a Maranzano protege, maintained a tight grip on his family until the late 1960s. Mobsters get the best nicknames. His operations included gambling, loan sharking, and drug trafficking, with a strong emphasis on loyalty and Sicilian traditions. The Profaci family, later known as the Colombo family, was controlled by Giuseppe Joe Profaci. Lucky Luciano's own family, born from the remnants of Massaria's crew, saw Vito Genovese take the helm after Luciano was sent to prison in 1936. When Genovese fled the country in 1937, Frank the Prime Minister Costello stepped in until Luciano was deported to Italy in 1947. How did they come up with these nicknames? Was there a subcommittee? Meanwhile, Vincent Mangano led the Gambino family until his mysterious disappearance in 1951, after which Albert Anastasia, infamous for his brutal methods, took over. The Lucchese family was headed by Tommaso Tommy Galliano, a figure less flashy but no less powerful. This sort of shuffle was indicative of all the five families. Power ebbed and flowed like the Hudson River. Between deaths, prison sentences, or flat-out deportation, part of what was so hard to arrest or charge about the five families was its ever-shifting dynamic. The commission wasn't solely a New York affair either. Al Capone's Chicago outfit, notorious for its ruthless efficiency, held a seat, although Capone's tenure was cut short by a lengthy prison sentence for tax evasion. Stefano Magaddino, leader of the Buffalo crime family, also had a seat, thanks to his control over illegal trade routes to Canada. Under Luciano's vision, the National Crime Syndicate, often called the Syndicate, united Italian, Irish, Jewish, and other criminal organizations under one umbrella, stretching from coast to coast. It was less about ethnicity and more about business, a criminal utopia where everyone got their cut. The five families enjoyed a relative calm until the late 1950s, when things took a dramatic turn. Luciano's absence via deportation left a power vacuum in the Luciano Genovese family. Frank Costello, a savvy and diplomatic leader, maintained control until Vito Genovese returned to the U.S. in 1945 and started plotting his return to power. Genovese's ambitions led to the assassination of Costello's ally, an increasingly syphilitic Willie Moretti, in 1951. 6 years later, Genovese made a direct move against Costello, sending Vincente the Chin Gigante to kill him. Costello survived the attempt, but wisely decided to retire, leaving Genovese unchallenged. Albert Anastasia, the feared head of the Mangano family, now known as the Gambino family, also met his end in 1957, courtesy of Genovese and his own underboss, Carlo Gambino. With Anastasia out of the picture, Gambino took control, marking the beginning of a new era for his family. 1957 also saw one of the most notorious events in Mafia history, the Appalachian meeting. Vito Genovese, feeling confident in his new role, organized a summit of Mafia leaders from across the country in the home of Joseph Joe the Barber Barbara in Appalachian, New York. The meeting was supposed to be a low-key affair to discuss business, but it ended in chaos when the police, acting on a tip, raided the gathering. Over 60 mobsters were arrested, and the event made headlines, blowing the lid off the Mafia's secretive operations. The 1960s saw the five families continue to grow their empires. However, it was also a period of significant internal strife. Joseph Bonanno's attempt to take over the commission and become capo di tutti capi led to the Banana Wars, a bloody conflict that saw Bonanno ousted and his family weakened. In other words, the Banana Wars were far less whimsical than they sound. The Colombo family, formerly the Profaci family, experienced similar turmoil when Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo rebelled against Joe Profaci's leadership, leading to a violent power struggle. The internal conflicts within the families, combined with increased law enforcement pressure, began to take a toll. By the 1970s, the five families faced increasing scrutiny from the FBI and other law enforcement agencies. The use of wiretaps, informants, and the RICO Act, which you'll remember from The Dark Knight as the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, allowed authorities to bring down numerous high-ranking mobsters. Despite these setbacks, the Mafia proved resilient. Leaders like John Gotti of the Gambino family, who became a media sensation in the 1980s, continued to exert significant influence. However, by the end of the 20th century, the Mafia's power had waned considerably. The combination of relentless law enforcement pressure, internal conflicts, and changing economic landscapes made it difficult for the families to maintain their traditional grip on organized crime. Analyze this probably didn't help things either. The story of the five families is a saga of ambition, power, and violence. From their roots in the Sicilian Mafia to their rise in the New York underworld, these families have left an indelible mark on American history. While their influence has diminished, their legacy continues to fascinate. That's why we keep making movies about them. So what do you think? What would your gangster nickname be? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.